So once upon a time, perhaps back when 20th century music was called modern, reception history tended to languish as a minor and comparatively low prestige area within opera studies. It was a place suited to those who did not or could not aspire to the high table, almost invariably reserved for those who busied themselves directly with composers and their works. However, sometime between then and now, a sea change might have occurred. At least when broadly defined, reception history has become a mainstream activity, perhaps even the mainstream activity among those who regard themselves as opera specialists. Its attractions are obvious, not least the fact that its denizens can congratulate themselves on having evaded the doubts now almost universally assumed to assail those for whom direct contact with composers and works remains at the center of operatic history-making. Better still, the proliferation of online resources, especially material from the long 19th century, makes newly available and newly searchable a vast array of relevant material, giving the welcome aura of discovery to those whose institutions can afford to breach the firewalls. Beckon as it might, though, this brave new disciplinary and digital world continues to present obstacles. One was pointed out many decades ago by Carl Dalhouse, whose book, Foundations of Music History, has a final chapter on reception history, a chapter that, as was the great man's wont, cunningly shadow boxes with what he saw as a dangerous new enthusiasm. Unless, Dalhouse wrote, reception historians reflect upon their criteria of selection, they are even more likely than their colleagues to be buried in the rubble of their source material, unquote. The question immediately rises, how can we avoid sequestration beneath this rubble? The German word is Schutt, particularly in its contemporary screen-delivered incarnation, particularly, and this is implicit in Dalhouse's warning, in a landscape where the ever-intact cathedrals of the past, those composers and their works, continue to loom over us. More fundamental still, at least for my purposes here, is another issue. Dalhouse mentioned criteria for selection. And it does indeed seem as though those pondering those criteria might be equally important, if not in the sense Dalhouse intended. He was referring to the kinds of material and the time frame within which that material resides. A famous example of his he gave was of the possibility of Bach reception emerging in 1829, for example. But his assumption, as demonstrated by that last example, was that such study would chiefly concern, yes, again, those composers and their works. And it was, I think, undeniable that that was indeed the principal focus of reception studies for some considerable time. Perhaps now, though, we are increasingly asking whether this concentration is inevitable. Indeed, whether such a focus might present a further obstacle to the emancipation of reception history. My attempted response to such impossible generalizations concerns operatic culture in early 1830s London and will involve a radical periodical, The Examiner, and an extraordinary cache of operatic criticism written in that periodical over 4 years by a man called Thomas Love Peacock. Now, in order to begin, I need briefly to sketch some background about theatrical life in London in the 1830s. After all, one obvious way in which we enrich our views of opera's place in the world is to think about broad institutional and social contexts and their effect on audience taste and behavior. And the situation in London is anyway markedly different from that much more musicologically familiar one obtaining in Paris. Now, one obvious way to characterize the ambience of 1830s operatic London is of a hierarchy of theatres that was breaking down under the strain of relentless urban expansion. The so-called patent theatres, Drury Lane and Covent Garden, together with the Theatre Royal Haymarket in the summer, were still technically the only ones allowed to perform serious drama, with other theatres, an ever-increasing number of them, competing in the lesser genres of vernacular opera, melodrama, burlesque, and so on. All dramatic representations, of course, included music. And I would want to say, and it's quite important for my argument here, that the notion of spoken drama as an antithesis to opera is, in my view at least, a mistaken and potentially distorting binary in London and perhaps everywhere else at this time. But it is nevertheless the case that the so-called illegitimate theatres featured music more prominently within the dramatic fabric, indeed were obliged by law to do so. What's more, the alarming popularity of some of these lesser genres forced the patent theatres to compete with their own operas or melodramas or burlesques, much to the disgruntlement of conservative critics. However, as if untroubled by these squabbles over the national theatrical heritage and residing at the top of this tangled theatrical tree in terms of audience prestige and ticket prices, was the King's Theatre in the Haymarket, whose season ran from around March to around August, in other words, coincided roughly with the season, and which performed twice weekly, sometimes more, almost exclusively Italian opera, sharing with the Théâtre Italien in Paris an upper echelon of Europe's wobbling galacticos. It's worth pointing out immediately that apart from the star singers in London, the London, which was undoubtedly the richest city in the world, boasted operatic feasts that were, in comparison with Paris, ever meagre and ever unpredictable, above all because they lacked the generous Parisian state subsidies and were diminished and frequently compromised as a result. Now, while London theatrical world, even with an inexorably expanding audience base, was fiercely competitive, it's often imagined that the King's Theatre and its Italian operatic fare was mainly in competition, at least in terms of aesthetic prestige, not with other theatres, but with London's expanding concert culture, notably such organisations as the Philharmonic Society, founded in 1813 and overtly dedicated to furthering the Viennese classics. Such a story of competition can, in the broadest brush of music social history, also be seen as a struggle between aristocratic and bourgeois musical taste. On one side dwells a noisy cohort of hooray Henrys at the King's Theatre, chattering through the recitatives and breaking 3 pairs of kid gloves, applauding Sontag and Malibran in the latest Bellini or Donizetti premiere, or, distressingly often for the purists, in a pasticcio thereof, cobbled together in despite of the absent composer in order to flatter the singers. On the other side dwelt a sober-minded cohort of middle-class self-improvers silently contemplating and fetishistically defending the integrity of certain endlessly repeated and canonized works by Beethoven and Mozart. If we add to this picture dutiful mention of the Great Reform Act, which in 1832, amid enormous controversy, expanded the political franchise to include many more of the aspirant middle classes, then the rise of the bourgeoisie might seem to be becoming made musically manifest. Now, I should say immediately that this simplistic picture has been nuanced often and effectively. William Weber and others have shown that, to be brief, aristocratic patronage was a powerful force in concert culture, just as was bourgeois attendance and appreciation of Italian opera. But it's nevertheless the case that a number of the most long-lasting and influential periodicals of the time, musical and otherwise, sustained this binary opposition, almost always on the side of concert culture. So it's with this background that we come to the Examiner and its operatic critic, Thomas Love Peacock. The Examiner was a weekly periodical founded on radical Political Principles by Leigh Hunt and his brother John in 1808. In the early 1830s, it was edited by Albany Fonblanc and was continuing its tradition of providing each Sunday a significant anti-establishment time to publish each week an account of recent political, domestic, and theatrical news, all with a radical but determinedly intellectual, in some ways patrician stance, all very much in opposition to both the dominant political influences of the time, the rabidly conservative Tories and the cautiously reforming Whigs. As Peacock himself put it in an early essay written long before his stint at the Examiner, there is a common influence to which the periodical press is subservient. It has many ultras on the side of power, but none on the side of liberty, one or two weekly publications excepted. And this is not from want of sufficient liberty of the press, which is ample to all purposes. It is from want of an audience. There is a degree of spurious liberty, a Whiggish moderation with which many will go hand in hand, but few have the courage to push inquiry to its limits. The conclusion is obvious that one of Peacock's principal tasks as an opera reviewer at the Examiner, which was undoubtedly one of those weekly publications he cited, his task was to be on the side of liberty. It would indeed be to push inquiry to its limit. But also, and crucially, he thought his task was to form an audience, as he says it, to construct a readership that could, in the broadest possible sense, form a political community by means of, or perhaps better, within Italian opera. There he is. Peacock, I will assume, is mostly unknown to you, and this is a rare portrait of him as a young man. Born in 1785, his early life coincided with and was sometimes closely entwined with the great figures of literary romanticism in England. But his differences from them were, as we shall see, important and will be critical to his views about opera. He was raised in precarious family circumstances, managed to self-educate himself in spite of chronic debt, acquired a formidable learning. He read uncommonly widely and knew many languages, including Greek, Latin, Italian, very importantly Italian, and French. He was particularly proud of his Greek, to the extent that at least one friend openly addressed him as Greeky-peaky. He was for a time caught up in the Shelley circle, serving as the poet's friend, secretary, and later memorialist. An abiding passion was for rivers. He wrote many poems and much reportage about the Thames, roamed along its paths, and lived for a good portion of his life by its banks. But he spent most of the latter part of his life, from 1819, rising through the ranks of the East India Company, where he showed a particular interest in steam navigation. Again, rivers were important, but this time rivers far from home. During the early 1830s, precisely the years he was writing his operatic criticism, he was also pursuing grandiose schemes for steam navigation of the Ganges and of various sea routes to India. Among his most important, we might now say infamous achievements, was to supervise the design and construction of a small fleet of iron war steamers, his so-called iron chickens, to which, classical to the last, he gave names such as Pluto, Proserpine, and Nemesis. These vehicles of colonial enforcement imperiously traveled up and down the Euphrates, the Tigris, the Indus, later seeing service in the first Opium Wars of 1839 to 42. And there you see on the far right the Nemesis blowing up Chinese vessels during the Opium War. This much will make clear that, like so many in the 19th century, Peacock displays what is for us a strange, even alienating collection of talents and attitudes. His literary reputation mostly rests now on a series of satirical novels that reside on the fringes of English literature, difficult to reconcile in spite of his Shelley connections with Romantic era mainstream. Literary scholar Marilyn Butler, who published in 1979 what is still the most challenging account of Peacock's milieu, suggests that he came of age intellectually around 1805 at what proved to be a critical moment in the attitude of English radicals. 1805, a period when France, once the political inspiration for people of his persuasion, was both at war with England and had betrayed its republican ideals by coming under the sway of a militaristic emperor. The curious amalgam that emerged was not easily assimilated into the dominant image we now have of Romanticism, having much more to do with stubbornly continuing Enlightenment attitudes, utilitarian, historicist, above all intellectual, and holding the conviction that intellectual inquiry was a good in itself, and thus in itself a form of political activism. Indeed, Peacock had many a polemical argument with the Romantic establishment, being particularly scathing about Wordsworth, the Wordsworth entourage, and its cult of nature. In one famous attack, he saw this group as, quote, converting the land they lived in into a sort of fairyland in which they peopled with mysticisms and chimeras, unquote. Now, I want now to turn to Peacock's theatrical criticism in the Examiner, which is generally thought to run from around February 1831 to around December 1834. And I need immediately to make clear, although his authorship of several columns in what was billed as the theatrical Examiner part of the paper is beyond question, there is considerable doubt, enormous doubt, about many others. In common with most periodicals of the time, the Examiner did not identify its authors. The voice was assumed to be that of the magazine, not of the individuals who wrote for it. Now, I don't have time to go into the Don't have time to go with the difficulties of authoritic attribution, but as is the case for the vast majority of periodical writings at this time, there can be rarely absolute certainty about authorship. The problem particularly concerns whether Peacock's literary brief, if you want, included theatrical criticism other than opera. I'm, for various reasons, pretty convinced that it does, but so far as I know, no Peacock specialist has addressed the matter. There's also the disconcerting fact that, as we know from Peacock's correspondence, he sometimes allowed a young assistant to take his reviewer's pass to the King's Theatre with instructions to report back on what had happened. So he didn't always turn up to the operas that he was critiquing. I should like, though, to take what might, in at least two senses of the word, be termed a liberal attitude to these authorship matters. There's little doubt that Peacock's view of opera, and indeed of theatre generally, was in tune with the Examiner's larger project, and a vain attempt to restrict this body of criticism to strict attribution rules would severely and damagingly restrict this body of criticism, the body of criticism and richness of what's on offer. To recall once more Dalhouse's resonant vocabulary, building with rubble may, after all, require new methods. That the Examiner's theatrical tone in these years could be direct in its political slant might best be illustrated by a year opening salvo in 1833, the year after the Reform Bill, about the season's pantomimes. It was probably written by Peacock, but again, the jury is out. 3 of the major pantomime characters are openly identified with the main political forces then in parliamentary play. Harlequin is the cautiously reforming Whig party, here called the Movement Party. Pierrot, here called the Clown, is the despicable Tory party, venal in its attempts to protect its privileges and hovering malignly over the entire action. A lean and slippered pantaloon is associated with the tottering aristocracy greedily hanging on to their ancient hegemony. So here's what the criticism says. It is probable that we shall never say all that is in us on the subject of pantomime, whose end is to hold up the mirror to politics. Harlequin is never quiet, never in repose, always flitting about, perpetually in pursuit. He represents the movement party, the Whigs in other words. The cap on his head is the cap of liberty, but of a sober, peaceful colour. His mask adumbrates the necessity for the ballot. The clown follows the personification of Toryism, a glutton and a thief, with a hand to seize and a pouch to hold, always in mischief and in roguery, a sworn foe of the innovator, ever persecuting or plundering, but with a blessed aptitude for running his head against a wall and catching stray buffets or slaps on faces. And who is his confederate, that lean, hobbling old fellow, as Leigh Hunt observed, so void of any handsome infirmity, with his wizen, sharp features, curling pigtail, long nutcracker-like nose and chin, pottering about in an incapacity for anything but to fall to and enjoy other men's meat? That is the aristocracy, the very age and body of aristocracy, the genius of the peerage. Those used to the kinds of censorship then obtaining in most of mainland Europe will immediately be struck by the freedoms here enjoyed and also by the uncomplicated manner in which supposedly innocent amusement is imbued with a decodable political message. The tone of the British press is very different from most on the continent. Now, in the middle pages of almost all weekly installments of the Examiner, as it happens, and perhaps significantly immediately before the section devoted to parliamentary reporting, appears the section, often more than a column in length, which means comprising many, many hundreds of words, entitled Theatrical Examiner. There's a typical page for you. In the season, this typically began, as here, with an account of opera at the King's Theatre. Then followed criticism of events at the Peyton Theatres, followed by whatever else London's many venues, of London's many venues that might have been interesting. This arrangement is important, confirming that opera was primarily seen, by this paper at least, as fundamentally, as I said before, a theatrical rather than a musical genre. Musical events, particularly the activities of the Philharmonic Society, tended to be covered in an entirely separate section of the Examiner, placed after the Theatrical Examiner, as were more occasional reviews of sheet music. Opera is there as a theatrical genre. Recall the musical political binaries adumbrated earlier, that emerging opposition between aristocratic privilege on show at the noisy King's Theatre with its Italian opera versus bourgeois values emerging in London's concert culture and its silent worship of the classics. In light of Peacock's philosophy and that of the journal in which he was writing, we might expect him at the least to show an ambiguous attitude to the operatic event, if not downright condemnation. A good example of just that attitude comes from William Hazlitt, whose writings on opera in the Examiner come from 20 years earlier and betray many of those expected sentiments. There's Hazlitt here describing the aristocratic occupants of the boxes. This is what he wrote in 1816. Splendid as they are, and splendid the appearance of those in them is, they do not breathe the spirit of enjoyment. They are rather like the sick wards of luxury and idleness, where people of a certain class are condemned to perform the quarantine of fashion for the evening, unquote. In common with many of his persuasion, Hazlitt made one operatic exception. He professed an adoration for Mozart's operas, one certainly encouraged by the fact that Mozart had made his reputation in London overwhelmingly as a classic instrumental composer. But it's also clear that Hazlitt's taste was very much geared to the composer's simplest, least ornamented vein, that a vein much nearer to English ballad opera, one might say. When a professional singer such as Josephine Fodor essayed Fiordaligi's music, for example, Hazlitt found that her voice was hard, metallic, and jarred like the reverberation of a tight string. Above all, according to Hazlitt and his generation, there should be no artifice. As he said, Mozart's music should come from the air and return to it. Now, in certain respects, Peacock conforms to this set of predictable attitudes. One of his most frequent complaints throughout his operatic criticism, for example, concerns the tendency of King's Theatre impresarios to allow Arie di Baule and others even more thoroughgoing alterations to those operas it staged. Another related complaint was about singers who, he supposed, abused their position by adding ornaments and generally placing themselves above the operatic work. And both of these abuses he deemed infinitely more egregious when they were applied to Mozart, for whom, like Hazlitt and that earlier generation of examiner writers, he reserved the highest possible praise. A performance of Le Nozze di Figaro in March 1833 brought out his full indignation about this and is as good an introduction to the Peacockian operatic critical mode as there is. The opening paragraph here, consists of 3 sentences. The first is of flamboyant complexity and density, with trademark citations from Golden Age theatre, reference to Ben Jonson's character Bobadil. There are gestures to Greek sculpture in the second, this ambitious display of learning, which is always there. And then comes a closing credo in the third sentence, reinforced with strident alliteration. So, sentence 1. There has been a performance of, or rather a perpetration on, Le Nozze di Figaro, so far beyond the common measure of contemptuous defiance of musical and dramatic propriety that we must conclude that the parties concerned in getting it up have been planet-struck like Bobadil when he took his cudgelling so graciously. Second sentence, there have been rumors of wars behind the curtain, and assuredly the work of Mozart has been presented before it much in the condition of a work of Phidias after a Turkish bombardment. Third sentence, but in both cases alike, the genius of the mighty master shines forth through all mutilations. Peacock then continues the review with, typically for him, a level of close detail that betrays intimate knowledge of the opera in question, and also, lest we should forget, equally intimate knowledge of its Italian libretto, all larded with yet more literary and this time also religious tropes. The whole conceit is what is more, enwrapped in an ironic tone that you see in that first paragraph, an ironic tone that's the very stuff of his novelistic mode. Now, the temptation at this point to fall into step with those binaries of what I called earlier the dominant political reading of this operatic period might here seem to lie before us invitingly. But such a conclusion is often complicated by a slower, more concentrated reading of Peacock's operatic attitudes. For one thing, it soon becomes clear that his insistence on the integrity of the individual operatic work has little or nothing to do with the developing middle-class concern for what has become known, courtesy of Lydia Gurr, as the work concept, and thus of a tendency to apply to opera the standards becoming important in concert culture. Far from it. Peacock's insistence on the work, on the integrity of the work, comes, if anything, from an opposite direction. This is quite important. An opposite direction, one that sees opera as fundamentally a dramatic rather than a musical genre, and thus is anxious to preserve what we might call the narrative coherence of the piece in question. Indeed, there's plenty of evidence that Peacock regarded operatic drama as, if anything, under threat by the incursion of musical priorities. For another thing, Peacock could, when he deemed circumstances propitious, celebrate individual singers with an extravagance to rival any aristocratic meloman of the old school. Here, there's often an unusual and challenging edge to his commentary on singers. Here he is in June 1833, writing about the effect of Maria Malibran as Amina in La Sonnambula. She makes the music of her part seem an essential constituent of its reality. Her voice is of extraordinary richness, sweetness, compass and power, and in its lower notes especially instinctive with the very soul of feeling which lie too deep for tears. Her musical skill is consummate, and in the very exuberance of her ornaments there are always meaning, appropriateness, and a regulating judgment which brings her down safely from those Pindaric flights into Cecilia's world of sound, which few would take and not fall like Icarus. But the spirit of music in the voice of Malibran soars on native pinions and not on Daedalian wings. Again, we have the generous, embarrassingly generous display of classical knowledge and of more recent literary illusion. His passing reference to the last line of Wordsworth's famous ode to immortality, quote, "To me the meanest flower that blows can give thoughts that do often lie too deep for tears." That might be thought to show that he was at least to some degree touched by romantic conceptions of the ineffable. But it's much more likely, I think, that it signifies his belief in the translatability into language of an art such as Malibran's, and the accompanying fact that hers was for him at base an art of impersonation, to be judged for its ability to communicate some essential dramatic and thus didactic truth. As he puts it, she makes the music not a thing in itself, but, quote, an essential constituent of her role's reality. A little earlier in the same review, he writes, her performance is therefore not only perfectly new, it's also perfectly true. It appears to us that she seldom errs either in the conceptions of character or in her realization of those conceptions in action, unless it be an error to adhere too closely to nature, and occasionally perhaps so to identify herself with the essential reality of her part as to sacrifice some portion of that ideal beauty with which the perfection of mere art might invest it. Now, some of this critique that I've just quoted may sound like the conventional reviewer speak of the times, in particular that reference to dramatic truth. But what's not conventional is the explicit distancing from the, quote, perfection of mere art. And in that sense, a distancing from what we are usually schooled to imagine as an increasing concentration during this period on the affective power of music. Peacock wrote in a slightly later essay that singers above all needed, quote, expression, 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 the one all-pervading and paramount quality without which dramatic music is but a tinkling cymbal, unquote. Now, this sense of a critical voice that, although clearly with a political edge, seems to confound existing narratives of the intersection of music and politics, is intensified the further one looks into Peacock's extensive theatrical critical writing. One obsession of Peacock's, for example, was to decry that emerging hero of the concert platform, the conductor. At the King's Theatre during this period, the baton was wielded by the Italian Michele Costa, and he came in for repeated Peacockian abuse, especially for what seems to have been his excessive zeal in the beating of time. We wish Signor Costa would consent himself with being visible and not audible in the orchestra. He taps his book with a vehemence that is a positive offence to the ear. It is not necessary in beating time to make such palpable hits. Note the reference to Hamlet there. He has literally beaten a hole in the top of his copy of the overture to Tancredi. We hope he will have the grace to amend his practice herein and be satisfied with subjecting the irresponsive air to his unavoidable battoon. It's clear in other critiques that Peacock's objection to the conductor was at base political. He saw the dramatic event, just like political debate, as one in which everyone should be actively engaged, and thus regarded the conductor as a dangerous harbinger of inequality. As he said elsewhere, each member of the operatic chorus should seem as if he knew he had some business of his own in the scene, and not as if he were a mere unit among 30 or 40 automata, all going like clockwork by the vibrations of the conductor's pendulum. But by far the most striking discordance between the political attitudes of the examiner and what we might expect of his operatic critic comes about in Peacock's attitude to the core repertory of the King's Theatre, which in those years, as I said, was an almost unrelieved diet of Bellini and Donizetti premieres and revivals, reinforced by Rossini and some of the lesser lights of the Primo Ottocento, all sung by the finest talents of the day, including Pasta, Malibran, Rubini, Tamburini, Lablache, and so on. Peacock, far from juxtaposing these composers, particularly Bellini, with the classics of the concert hall, particularly Mozart, and finding them examples of decadent aristocratic taste, far from doing that, he clearly thought of Bellini and Donizetti as the pinnacles of modern dramatic art, as a logical continuation of the spirit of Mozart's operas, rather than as examples of trivializing aristocratic taste. He also had consistent praise for the libretti of Felice Romani at a time when all Italian opera libretti were routinely excoriated. Again, the particular circumstance of his classical and other linguistic talents seem here to join hands with his passionately held political views about the utility of art. He deemed Bellini's supposed weakness in harmony a positive advantage, and in one review, and in a later essay devoted entirely to the composer, attempted to demonstrate with musical examples how certain Bellinian melodies were, in his words, almost classical, in the manner in which they could be reduced to a skeletal form, thereby revealing a strict note-for-note correspondence between the basic melodic shape and the verse forms of, you've guessed it, ancient Greek poetry. There's a little example. It's a stripped-down version of Arnon Giunge from La Sonnambula. Greeky-peaky seems to touch hands with Rudolf Reti at this point. As he concluded, quote, after this example, we give this as an experiment merely, valeat quantum valeat, but we conceive it is not very discrepant from such a melody as might have been sung in the Athenian theatre, unquote. Incidentally, given this distinctly homemade analytical enthusiasm, it's small surprise that Peacock found Norma, even with Pasta as the protagonist, to have melodies, quote, too much buried in harmony, often more ambitious than appropriate. The fluidity of word setting in Casta Diva would have failed disastrously to translate into a faux Athenian ditty. But the essential point was quite other. His analysis was nothing more or less than an attempt to demonstrate that Bellini's form of musical drama could aspire to the highest artistic standards. To quote again from an earlier artistic credo, All the efforts of the fine arts are addressed to the passions. They foster and soothe the passions of love, ambition, and vanity, but they also teach men to admire skill and ability and to take delight in something else than war, gaming, gluttony, and idleness, which are the vices of all savages. As succeeding artists improve upon each other, their countrymen become ever more discerning and skillful, till at last a great proportion of mankind can learn to take delight in the exertion of thought and in pursuits of literature and of knowledge. Those were the stakes that Peacock was claiming for modern Italian opera in London at its finest, no more, no less than the transformation of society. Now, in August 1834, Peacock's East India Company duties were becoming ever more onerous. Those iron chickens with their sinister underworld names were in the making. Soon they would be in active service in the Opium Wars. Their creator later called them, quote, the infernal flotilla dispatched against the celestial empire, unquote. He would soon relinquish his post as the theatrical examiner, and on the last day of August wrote what must have been consciously a valedictory column. The context is an unenthusiastic consideration of the latest attempt to write a convincing example of English opera, in this case John Barnett's decidedly mortal opera, The Mountain Sylph. But as a prelude to this, Peacock tries to articulate what might be called a philosophy of opera once more, one in which his recourse to the image of the river, that poetic constant in his life, for better or worse, is surely indicative of his seriousness of purpose. Here's his valediction. Musical genius is not implied by the possession of learning or taste, nor when we use the term in connection with the composition of an opera should we be content with having it borne out by a few melodies merely, however tender and true in fancy or real in the expression of pathos. The interspersion of a stream or two of genuine harmony never floated an opera safely. An opera should be itself one stream of harmony. An opera of genius should be one deep and rushing river of music, broken as it might be in its course by various and sparkling turns, but reflecting always on its clear surface the grave and the gay of the heavens that lie above. Such are the wonderful operas of the German and Italian schools combined, though of those true masters of the realm of sound who have of late years exchanged their riches fineless with each other, and in whose great works we now therefore see the most perfect accompaniment of genius, returning in the shapes of enjoyment, gaiety, and love to inform learning with life and beauty. Now, in that final hymn to the deep and rushing river of music, Peacock was troping, perhaps in silent homage, part of a famous essay by Hazlitt from 1819, discussing in eulogistic terms the magic flute, or rather, il flauto magico. Here's what Hazlitt said: the whole opera is one continued and deep river of music, breaking every possible turn of course and variety of service, and exhibiting every aspect of the heavens that lie above it. But as you can see from this quote, Peacock's operatic embrace is broader, much broader, and ultimately more generous. He sees opera as nothing less than a scuola di sentimento, one whose pursuit of beauty through dramatic expression will ultimately, as he puts it, inform learning with life and beauty, and by this didactic method lead to the betterment of mankind. My last slide is a photograph of Peacock in later life, long after his operatic adventures with the Examiner. The unassuming demeanor, the half smile, the mixture of seriousness of purpose and lightness of touch, all this sums up better than I can the peculiar, rather enigmatic charm of the man and his writing. And perhaps the face also gives a hint of the firmness of purpose, the ruthlessness even, that could see him prosper behind the scenes in the East India Company's colonial adventures. In this paper, I've no more than skimmed the surface of his work during those 4 years, from 1831 to 1834. The Theatrical Examiner over that period comprises, at a rough estimate, something over 250,000 words. Even on the most conservative estimates of Peacock's authorship, his quota cannot have been less than around 75,000 words, and was, by my reckoning, a good deal more. All in all, then, a formidable body of work, especially when so little of it descends into the routine. What is more, it's a body of work barely addressed, either in musicology or in literary studies. Now, as I said at the start, his theatrical criticism is deeply involved in the political and the social. Opera is consistently seen by Peacock as embedded in society by its very nature, with the power to alter that society in fundamental ways if the circumstances are right. But I also mean the criticism is embedded in a more literal sense, nesting as it did in the middle of the Examiner, the most important place in the periodical. His column was routinely flanked by parliamentary reporting or by occasional other articles of great seriousness, perhaps on the abolition of the slave trade, or surely not without irony, on the activities of the East India Company. So what can such a journey, such a progress through this torrent of critical prose tell us? One important lesson for me was that continuous attention to one publication during one particular stretch of time, and thus, if you will, to one voice, one critical voice, encourages a particular kind of engagement with the material of reception history. It's an engagement markedly different from, say, projects that collect all the available reviews of a particular operatic work. Projects, in other words, unashamedly put the work or the composer at the center of the investigation. What's more, and as many have pointed out, I'm thinking in particular of a recent issue of the American journal Representations, devoted to the idea of search, and also to a slightly later article by Ben Walton in the same journal. Also, the word search facility that invites and enables such compendia, collections of reviews of individual works, while it can be a great boon to researchers, also has consequences that are less positive. A tendency to undervalue context and overvalue simple, easily recordable data. Not to mention a tendency to assume that any given search is more neutral than in fact it is. Whatever the case, I confess to having ignored such technology and reading quite slowly the entirety of the Theatrical Examiner for the 6 years between January 1830 and December 1835, thus gaining a pre- and post-Peacock perspective. This kind of slow reading has different challenges and, of course, different limitations from that enabled by word search technologies. But it is, I think, also likely to produce a different kind of understanding and, not to be ignored, a different and more intense degree of pleasure, simple pleasure in the text. For one thing, ancient periodicals, when read in this way, become intensely conversational. I use this word to refer to the obvious way in which these periodicals endlessly gesture towards, steal from, compete with their rivals in the marketplace of 19th century media capitalism. But I also mean that the seriality of periodicals encourages them into a continuous, week by week, season by season, year by year dialogue with their hidden readership, with that audience which Peacock was so passionate about creating via periodicals within society, and an audience to which we too can feel we belong if we can read with sufficient patience. So in closing, I want to suggest that this kind of study, not geared to composers and works, but instead engaged with one person's or one journal's quotidian experience of the operatic event among a host of competing theatrical entertainments, although it's obviously local and obviously partial, may in some way enable a more complex notion of how opera might relate to politics and the social. A notion in which opera retains actually many of its 18th century features, not least its aristocratic associations and its placement as basically a theatrical rather than musical genre, but in which it also partakes of the reforming project of 19th century Britain, indeed can be seen as a potential force in the formation of a different, more inclusive society. To return one last time to Dalhousie, I don't, in other words, believe that reading Peacock's theatrical criticism, I don't believe that in doing that I've been dealing with rubble, still less with material that will mainly be relevant for the passing insights it will offer in rebuilding or shoring up those cathedrals, those composers and their works looming from the past. No, in the spirit of my chosen author, I want to reach for a different metaphor. So here we have it. Reception history of opera can renew itself if it bursts the banks of ancient constraints. It can then join hands with scholars from other disciplines and become part of one deep and rushing river. It will be broken in its course by various and sparkling turns, but it can nevertheless reflect on its clear surface the fact that opera's historical meaning need not be bound by the imaginary museum we have made in its image. Thank you.